A malicious file can hide in plain sight, pass through scanners, look harmless in analysis tools, and still infect a system within seconds. And the worst part? Sometimes your antivirus genuinely cannot recognize what it's looking at. Welcome to BlueHat Cybersec Academy. If you've ever wondered how malware keeps bypassing detection, or why the exact same malware can keep reappearing in new versions without changing much internally, this is one of the biggest reasons why. It's called malware packing. And in this episode of the Malware Encyclopedia, we're breaking down how attackers compress, encrypt, and disguise malware to evade detection, how packed malware actually works, why security tools struggle against it, and how defenders fight back. So imagine this. You download a file, you scan it, no alerts, no warnings, looks completely clean, but the moment you open it, hidden malicious code silently unpacks itself in memory, and the infection begins. That's malware packing. At its core, malware packing is the process of compressing, encrypting, or obfuscating malicious code so security tools can't easily recognize it. Think of it like putting something dangerous inside a sealed box. From the outside, everything appears normal, but internally, the payload is still there, waiting to be opened. A packed malware file usually contains two things. First, the hidden malware itself, and second, a small unpacking program called a stub. When the file runs, the stub activates first, restores the hidden malware in memory, and then transfers execution to the real payload. And all of this usually happens in milliseconds. Most users never notice anything unusual. Now here's the important part. Packing itself is not automatically malicious. Legitimate developers sometimes compress software to reduce file size or protect code. But attackers abuse the exact same concept because it gives them one massive advantage: evasion. Traditional antivirus solutions often rely heavily on signatures, basically recognizable patterns tied to known malware. Packing changes the appearance of the file dramatically, so even if the malware internally remains almost identical, externally it suddenly looks completely different to the scanner. That means signatures may fail, hashes become useless, static analysis becomes harder, and attackers can repeatedly repack the same malware into thousands of unique-looking variants. From a defender's perspective, that becomes a nightmare, because instead of dealing with one recognizable threat, security tools suddenly face endless versions of the same malware wearing different disguises. And honestly, that disguise is sometimes enough to bypass detection entirely. The actual packing process is surprisingly straightforward. First, attackers create the malware payload itself. That could be ransomware, spyware, banking trojans, info stealers, or remote access trojans. Then they pass the malware through a packer. The packer may compress the executable, encrypt parts of it, obfuscate code, hide API calls, or modify sections of the file structure. At that point, the malware becomes much harder to inspect statically. Then the packed file gets distributed through phishing emails, fake downloads, cracked software, game cheats, malicious ads, or fake installers. And this is where people often underestimate the risk, because packed malware rarely looks dramatic. Most of the time, it looks completely ordinary. Then comes the final stage. The victim executes the file. The unpacking stub activates. The hidden payload restores itself in memory, and the malware begins running normally. That detail matters a lot, because many security tools still focus heavily on files stored on disk. Packed malware delays exposing its real code until execution happens. So by the time the dangerous payload fully appears, the process may already be running. Now, you'll often hear two terms in this space: packers and crypters. People use them interchangeably, but they're not exactly the same thing. A packer mainly focuses on compression and obfuscation. A crypter focuses much more aggressively on antivirus evasion through encryption and constantly changing code patterns. Some packers, like UPX, are actually legitimate tools used by developers. Crypters, on the other hand, are heavily associated with malware operations and underground cybercrime services. And yes, there are entire underground markets dedicated to selling so-called fully undetectable crypters. Of course, Nothing stays undetectable forever. But attackers usually don't need forever. Sometimes a few hours or days of evasion is already enough to infect thousands of systems. And malware packing keeps evolving. Some malware uses runtime packers, meaning the payload only unpacks during execution. Other malware uses polymorphism, where the appearance changes every time the malware spreads, even though the functionality stays mostly the same. Then there's metamorphic malware, which goes even further by rewriting its own code structure entirely while preserving behavior. And honestly, that becomes incredibly difficult to detect consistently because there may not even be a stable signature left to track anymore. Advanced threat actors often build custom private packers too, because public packers eventually become recognizable to security vendors. Custom packers give attackers a better chance of staying invisible. Now here's why packed malware is such a serious problem. It attacks one of the biggest weaknesses in traditional cybersecurity: static analysis. Static analysis examines files without executing them, but packing hides important indicators like strings, instructions, API calls, payload logic, and other recognizable patterns. So the malware may appear harmless right up until execution begins. And once the payload unpacks itself in memory, the attack is already underway. That's why modern cybersecurity increasingly focuses on behavior instead of just signatures. Researchers now care less about whether a file looks malicious and more about whether it behaves maliciously, because behavior is much harder to fake consistently. Security researchers also look for clues that indicate packing. For example, packed files often show unusually high entropy because encrypted or compressed data appears statistically random. Some packed files contain suspicious sections like AUT, UPX, or randomized names. Others hide API imports until runtime, creating strangely tiny import tables. And many packed malware samples display self-modifying behavior, allocating memory, writing executable code into it, and then jumping directly into those newly created memory regions. Those are major red flags during analysis. And if you look at real-world malware, packing appears everywhere. Decoded relied heavily on obfuscation and constant repacking. TrickBot used modular packing systems to complicate analysis. Zeus frequently distributed encrypted payloads. And Agent Tesla commonly used commercial crypters designed specifically to bypass antivirus software. So how do defenders fight back? Eventually, packed malware usually has to reveal itself in memory to execute properly, and that creates opportunities for analysts. Researchers use sandboxing, dynamic analysis, not invisibility forever, just invisibility long enough for execution to happen, long enough for the payload to unpack, and long enough for the infection to begin before detection catches up. And honestly, that single concept completely changed modern malware evasion. Instead of constantly building brand new malware from scratch, attackers often just change how the malware is wrapped, encrypted, compressed, or disguised. Internally, the payload may stay almost identical. Externally, it keeps changing shape. And that's exactly why malware packing remains one of the most effective evasion techniques in cybercrime today. Now, before ending this episode, here's a quick challenge for you. If packed malware eventually has to unpack itself in memory to run, why do you think attackers still gain such a massive advantage from packing it in the first place? And which do you think is harder to detect consistently? Polymorphic malware or metamorphic malware? Drop your answers in the comments. And if you enjoyed this episode of the Malware Encyclopedia, consider liking the video, sharing it with someone interested in cybersecurity, and subscribing to BlueHat Cybersec Academy for more deep dives into how modern malware actually works behind the scenes.